So I'd just like to say Tanshe, Tracy, Friedel, Apita, Wito, Gosuin, Niao, Iskwe, Nia, Manato, Sikahagwan, Otsi, Niao. And so what I'm saying when I say that is, that's Cree, and I'm saying my name. Hello, my name is Tracy Friedel, and I'm a Métis Cree woman from the people of Lac St. Anne in west central Alberta. And so I'd like to just begin by saying or just to acknowledge myself as a guest on the traditional ancestral unceded lands of the Musqueam people, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work and learn in this place. And so presenting with me today is Mahtab Eskandari, a PhD student in curriculum and pedagogy, and also Allyson, Rayner of the UBC Community Learning Initiative. And they will each take a bit more time to introduce themselves later on as well. So our talk today is focused on decolonizing learning through the lens of place, community, and experience. And Allyson and I will just sort of begin by introducing some of the theoretical background involved with this work, following which I will describe in just really basic terms, a research project involving a graduate class here at UBC. And then Mahtab, who was a part of that class-based project, she'll describe how she has carried that experience forward in specific ways. And then we'll sort of close with a hands-on activity that we feel is helpful for understanding how to put some of this theory into practice. Okay, so can I get you to go to the, great. So just a really brief look at the sort of what I'd say is the resurgence of place-based learning over the past couple of decades or so. Euro-Western philosopher Edward Casey makes the case for place when he says it is impossible to imagine what it would be like if there were no places in the world. So place has been a focus of educational theorists for some time now. John Dewey is often referred to as an early advocate of place-based education, specifically with respect to the connections he makes between education, the environment, and experience. Following in the tradition of Dewey's progressive education, since the 1990s, place-based learning has been reinvigorated, most particularly in rural U.S. contexts. So today it's often linked to environmental education, nature-based learning, and so forth. Woodhouse and Knapp are two of the more well-known authors in that context. And a focus of the local is a central feature of place-based learning, and David Sobel has written extensively about that. So this idea of emphasizing the unique history, environment, culture, economy, literature, and art of the region in which schools exist is the idea here. There's also often a citizenship focus, the idea that learning can connect curriculum to real concerns in particular places. And in this context, David Greenwood is quite prolific, as well as Nell Noddings has written a bit in this area. So for Indigenous peoples, place-based learning is fundamental to tribal epistemologies. In other words, place-based learning is crucial to restoring principles of traditional Indigenous education. And here, Gregory Kahedi has written quite a bit. As he writes, shared experience is the basis of Indigenous teaching and precipitates learning that nourishes and reinforces natural connections to land and community. So just to move on from there into this idea of decolonizing learning, over the past decade and a half or so, decolonizing learning as well as research has intended to center not only the structure and processes of colonialism, but also how these are implicated in the past and the present. So the purpose of decolonizing learning is to disrupt various structures and processes at the level of the individual as well as more broadly. In the process of this disruption, space is made for reinstituting Indigenous peoples' rights and responsibilities and for restoring tribal epistemologies as envisioned by Indigenous collectives. So basically this increased attention on decolonizing learning is a response to ongoing hegemony as enacted through settler colonialism perpetual crisis at the level of global economics, expanding power accruing to transnational capitalism, and the continued egregious assaults enacted on local places. I'll go to the next one. Thus, just to bring these things together, important to a notion of decolonizing place-based learning is not only connections to land and community, but also the links between local learning and larger issues, for instance, at the provincial, national, global level. And as suggested, ideas about decolonizing place-based learning are inherently connected to critiques of neoliberal economics, the erasure of places, their rendering into commodities, and also to the imperative of the growing transnational connections between groups invested in resisting such external, seemingly invisible manipulation. So at the same time, there are increasing demands for a reinstitution of political autonomy by Indigenous groups surging back from the historical experience of colonialism. This has served to further refocus our attention on places. By reaffirming the practical, including a sort of a groundedness in land, Indigenous peoples offer us a way to rethink both notions of place and ideas about the nature of our resistance to colonialism. So we need look no further than the Idle No More movement for a concrete example of this. So how does this notion of decolonizing place-based learning fit with larger strategic efforts of an institution such as UBC? I'll turn it over to Allyson, as I mentioned, of the Community Learning Initiative, to make some of these sort of interesting, important connections.
I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what community-based experiential learning is, so quite complementary to place-based learning, and then how it's situated here at UBC, the office that I work for. So what is community-based experiential learning? Very, very simply, it is when the student leaves the walls of the classroom and works with a community organization, but not on any random project. The project is really intentionally framed with learning outcomes, and it's supposed to be of use and of benefit to the community partner too. And so there's that balance there. There's that mutual benefit. The project is intentionally designed to respond to community-identified concerns, facilitate collaboration amongst diverse stakeholders. It's designed so the student will learn about the context of communities, and so it will connect back to classroom learning. And so it's very much grounded in the discipline, in the learning outcomes of the course. Here's another visual that you can use to represent community service learning. It's the center of curriculum, meaningful service, and reflection. And the reflection is really a key component of community-based experiential learning, because that's what really pulls out the key learnings. That's how you really come to understand the systemic factors facing a community that you're working with, or that's how you come to understand critical thinking and how that's used in today's society. Central tenets, which is related here with Indigenous context, is that it values community as knowledge keepers. The community and the faculty are co-educators, and the locus of knowledge is really in those two places, and it's meaningful and beneficial to both the student and the community. Theoretical lineages, similar to place-based learning. It goes back to Dewey and Lewin. Goes to Kolb's experiential learning cycle. Some linkages to Freire, and then Furco is one of the recent ones. But Kolb is really the one that's cited the most. And so you have a concrete experience in the community. You're working on creating a gray water filtration system for the YWCA or something like that. Within the classroom, the faculty member, the instructor will do some sort of reflective observation. The student will then come up with an idea or theory of how these things are actually working in society, and then they'll go to active experimentation. And this is how these learnings really get situated in the student's mind. The literature says, this is all literature-based, some of the key learning outcomes for community-based experiential learning are in three realms: academic learning, civic engagement, and personal growth. So some of the key ones in academic learning is that the student will come to integrate community settings and knowledges into academic learning. And so because knowledge is within the community, they'll start to bring that knowledge into their classroom learning and see how it interconnects. And they're able to see better how the theory that they're learning in class actually relates to the real world. And so it's not just knowledge for knowledge sake anymore, it's knowledge for use. Civic engagement, really learning about complex community contexts. Learning about the systemic factors underlying community needs, personal growth. They'll learn about career interest areas. And depending on the community that you're working within, you might come to know a little bit about your own social location. So those are just some of the student learning outcomes of community-based experiential learning. Some of the community partner outcomes that the literature has talked about, and some of the research coming out of my office, is that there's increased capacity for the community partners, and that's in terms of it frees up some staff time. There's new ideas and innovative ideas coming into the organization. There's new services and products that the students create for the organization. And then there's also extra hands on deck for them to do emergent projects. There's also this notion of cultivating future volunteers. One of the outcomes of community service learning is that students will often find meaning in continued engagement with community. And so there's this idea of cultivation of future volunteers. And then cultivation of knowledgeable citizens as a whole. But where can things go off the rails with community-based experiential learning? There's a lot of ways that it can go off the rails. So superficial collaboration with community partners. Yeah, come work with our students, but really can you just educate them? And so they're really superficially engaged. Or maybe the instructor isn't really respecting the community partner's knowledge that they hold. There's insufficient help to scaffold students' thinking about complex social issues. So if that reflection component isn't done properly, some potentially negative stereotypes could get reinforced. There really needs to be that intentional reflection. And if there's too little time in the community, then the community might not seek the benefits that they're supposed to. The community might not reap the benefits that they're supposed to. And so these are some of the things that can really trip you up. And then with this work, there's a lot of logistical things. The project that the student will work on is created with the faculty member and the community partner over a number of weeks or months. And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong there, and schedules. The academic timeline is a lot different than community timeline. So there's a lot of logistical things that can go off the rails. But they're kind of easier to take care of than these other ones, superficial collaboration or disrespect of knowledge. So what does this do? So with community-based experiential learning, it kind of stops this unidirectional separation that happens in education. So if community is involved at all, it's typically the community speaking with the faculty who then lectures the students. And that's if the community is involved at all. And then with the bubbles like this, it makes it seem that faculty and students are at the same level, that they bring the same amount of knowledge or experience. And so really, typical education looks like this, and maybe the community is involved. And what this leads to, in an Indigenous context, universities devaluing of Indigenous knowledge systems, research which is irrelevant to community priorities, graduating students who are uninformed of Aboriginal communities because it's removed from the pedagogy. But CBEL is a repositioning of stakeholders. There's an intersection and interaction between community, faculty, and students. And community service learning, community-based experiential learning lives at the center. It's really something that works for students, community, and faculty. And what that leads to, in a perfect world, building of community capacity, research learning activities which are relevant to community priorities, graduating students who are more informed of Aboriginal communities. So what? So this could be an appropriate pedagogical tool to use in classrooms that are focused on Indigenous issues and working with Indigenous communities. And it's working towards decolonized curriculum because it is bringing the community back to the center. So that's community-based experiential learning, the overview. And now at UBC. So I work for the UBC Community Learning Initiative. It's a central unit on campus, meaning that we work in VP students. We don't work with any particular faculty, although we do have staff in a number of different faculty. We work with faculty members to implement this in courses for course credit. So instead of writing an essay, they'll do this for course credit. We also have co-curricular activities, so the students will sign up for weekly placements on the side. We have international and local community service learning opportunities, which is really cool. And since 2006, we've had 11,000-ish students do community-based experiential learning, and we've worked with 450-ish community partners. So there's definitely a lot going on here. Community-based experiential learning at UBC. So CSL, which is part of community-based experiential learning, that's one pedagogy of the umbrella term, was positioned as a key priority by the university. It's one of the E3s, and I'm not sure if you guys know what E3s are, but they're enhanced experiential education opportunities. And so other E3s are small classrooms, internships, first-year labs, that kind of thing. And CSL is one of the E3s, and it was positioned as a key priority in the Place and Promise report. CBEL is across faculties. There's so much going on in each of the faculties. In the CLI, we have staff in applied science, solder, arts, and LFS. And so what they do is they work with the staff and students. They work with faculty and students to get this type of learning in different courses. And then we also have partnerships with education, with the teacher education office. We're working with them on the enhanced practicum. Science, forestry, dentistry, pharmacy, and nursing. So there's so much going on. And some of the examples of the ways of doing community-based experiential learning. One thing we're doing with nursing, I think it is, or no, it's health sciences, is we're bringing 4 to 5 community partners and maybe about 10 students into something that we've called engagement studios. And over the course of a couple of months, they'll come up with synergies between everybody in the room, some identified projects, and then they get a little bit of funding to carry out that project, small projects that will hopefully lead to something bigger. So those are called engagement studios. We have multi-year issue-based partnerships where we're looking at things like building a playground for one of the schools where their playground is going to get torn down, and so looking at how UBC resources can be used in that area. We have a number of those different types of partnerships. And we have anywhere from capstone courses to first-year projects, and so the level at which these projects are being carried out is really varied. There's student-initiated projects where we award grants from anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 to students. We also have weekly co-curricular placements where students are going to tutor or mentor students in homework clubs or something like that. And we also have reading week activities where they do 3-day, really intentional projects around Vancouver. And then we also have research partnerships with education, dentistry, medicine, and pharmacy. So yeah, there's a lot going on in our office. And this is our structure. So we have, I'm not sure if this is actually going to be interesting. So we've got 4 members of our team who are really community partner facing, really trying to understand what's happening in the community, what organizations are out there. We have 5 members of our team who are faculty facing, really focused on we have 1 staff in applied science, LFS, solder, and arts. And then we also have somebody who's working across faculties. We have an international oriented team, and they have a lot of partnerships in Africa specifically, and then we have the research and evaluation team. That's the team that I'm on, and we've got 2 people in my team, and I'm the manager of research and evaluation. And so what I'm supposed to be doing is really understanding the learning that happens as a result of this type of pedagogy, and the learning that is for the students and for the community partners, and how it might influence professional careers of the faculty that we work with, and then the process that leads to those learning outcomes.
Under that premise, I actually sought in a couple years ago, actually, to sort of situate the place-based learning course that I was teaching, a graduate course, which was making use of service learning, the idea of service learning. So I created some partnerships in that course and had students engage with these partners on particular projects that had some connection with place-based learning. And in some ways, my approach was very much meant to be a decolonizing place-based approach. So I'm going to just describe a little bit about that study here. And again, just keeping in mind that these educational efforts, and this one in particular, was meant to sort of support the and or restoration of significant local traditional places. So there was the service learning, but there was also the literature we were reading, and the individuals we had come in as guest speakers and so forth. And it, as Allyson has said, it is real places that provide the context for these sorts of forms of connected learning. So just the next slide. Oh, sorry, yeah. Did I go through all that? Yeah, so this slide, just to begin, the study itself was aimed to sort of look at three things. So how this course would actually impact student learning, as Allyson described, how students' sense of Indigenous and community issues may be impacted by their experience in the course, and how their attitude towards the work of social change in a graduate level course might be altered. So just on the next slide, the way I approached the study was to think of it as a qualitative case study, 14 graduate students, and the data included pre- and post-course surveys which looked at sort of students' efficacy in terms of some of the main objectives of the study. I used student reflection journals and also some follow-up interviews to try to understand those things. Analysis, inductive thematic analysis, was the approach I've been taking with students, and also some intercoder reliability, typo there. So, yeah. So just in terms of the survey findings themselves, again, this was a survey I actually borrowed from some of the service learning literature. It's commonly used. And it basically is looking at students' sort of efficacy for the work of social change. And at the beginning of the course, I had students complete the survey, and they scored quite high out of 5. The average was 4.11 in terms of, you know, their preference for social change over charity. So quite often in the service learning literature, what you'll find is service learning efforts tend to fall along a continuum where, on the one hand, you have efforts that are meant, you know, that sort of speak to students who are looking to sort of give back and that kind of thing, a charity model, to another extreme where students are looking to really contribute to the work of social change. So for these graduate students coming in, the idea of working for social change took precedence over charity, over working, you know, the charity model. The post-course survey was interesting in the sense that sort of that difference remained, so that preference for social change over charity remained, but there was a significant decrease in both realms. So students felt less able to contribute to the work of social change, and also felt that their efforts were you know, far less so in terms of that idea of giving back. And so, you know, the question then becomes, why is that so? Why did both of those numbers drop so significantly? And so one of the things I've been working with graduate students on this research project, and we've met a few times to analyze some of the findings, the early findings, and one of the things we've realized is that sort of an event that I had sort of built into the course curriculum was what was supposed to be a MOA exhibit, the Museum of Anthropology, an exhibit called The Forgotten. And this was supposed to take place in February of 2011. And what it was is the artist, now her name escapes me, had basically created these sort of 4x8 paintings of some of the missing and murdered women in the downtown east side. And they were, you know, being planned for exhibit at MOA in February. But what happened is the community, there was a number of Indigenous community groups and so forth who, you know, took issue with the fact that this non-Indigenous researcher had been employed to create this exhibit. And so there was quite a bit of debate going on, and eventually MOA decided to cancel the exhibit. One of the things, for example, that the community was concerned about is, the photographs that she used to create some of these paintings were actually police, like, mugshots of some of those women and so forth. And the idea that the artist hadn't worked closely with community, hadn't sought their approval and so forth. So that was canceled, and what took its place was actually a one-day symposium on UBC in March of that year, where community groups were actually brought onto campus at Green College. A number of faculty members, lots of students were there, and basically folks were able to sort of hear a bit of the backstory to this whole issue around the forgotten, and also more about the issue of missing and murdered women in general. So it was a really moving event. It was called Forgotten Women. So the first part was in November, and then the MOA exhibit, but instead it was this symposium that happened at Green College. And so it was about dialogues for change, and I had built that event into the course, given that the other one was not happening. And what seemed to happen, though, in terms of the idea of decolonizing place-based learning and the Service Learning Initiative in particular, is I think the dialogues themselves sort of raised the profile of some of the challenges of of dealing with some of these social issues. So when we think about feelings of efficacy towards social change, when you're talking about systemic kinds of things such as missing and murdered women, I think it really caused students to sort of pull back and realize sort of like what we were dealing with here was something more than a quick service learning project could sort of ameliorate. So we realized that this was sort of a turning point in the course, and had really shifted folks' ideas of thinking about efficacy in this area in general. So some of the major issues that came out of the student journals is this idea of thinking that much could be accomplished through community service learning in this course, and then coming to understand the complexity of the situation. The Forgotten Women was hugely disrupting, as I mentioned, on both of those counts. And finally, from the start, some students conceived of service learning as being about enhancing Indigenous individual and collective relations. And it was in the case of those students, I think, where where the drop was least. So the students who saw the event as sort of the beginning of building relations between community and students and so forth, they tended not to have sort of pulled back as far as the other students. So that was kind of an interesting finding as well. So one of the placements that we used in that year was the Her Story Cafe, partnership between them and the Stanley Park Ecology Society. And they typically do walking tours, and the walking tour that was the focus of the service learning placement in the course was attended to the idea of history, gender, and landscape. And so we had a student who actually worked with this placement, and also we ended up as a class doing the guided walking tour that was arranged as a part of that. And so the student who worked in that placement is Mahtab, and she's come to just provide a little bit of perspective from her viewpoint on that experience, and also what that experience has led to the kinds of further thinking and research that she's been doing since then. So I'll turn it over to Mahtab.
All right, so my name is Mahtab. I'm a PhD student in EDCP, Curriculum and Pedagogies. And it was at the very beginning of my journey when I took the place-based course with Tracy. So I was among the group of the graduate students in that class. And when I saw Her Story Cafe, it kind of grabbed my attention because it was at the intersection of environmentalism and humanism. And that was my sort of interest, the ecology meeting with the history. And I chose this project to participate in during 3 months of engagement with Jolene, who was the person to guide me through that journey. My relationship with the land, defined as a segment of the Stanley Park, sort of unfolded and grew out of dimensions of time and place. So 3 months of January to March, I was critically engaged with the project, and something that emerged for me was the relationality and the kind of association of land, ecology, mapping, and the design of the park with the structures of the power, with the narratives, and with the dominant voices within that region, within that place called Stanley Park. And I sort of started paying attention to the narratives that were not included or were not sort of imaged through signs or roads that were designed to lead us through the park. And I sort of started to look for the disenfranchised narratives and stories. And I sort of started to try to track the invisible stories, the stories through the Vancouver archives, through the city of Vancouver. So Stanley Park and my involvement, my engagement with that community, with that place, sort of connected me with multiple communities in Vancouver. Vancouver Archive was one of them, City of Vancouver, Vancouver Museum, and I sort of started paying attention to the notion of design and how the park was designed, how environment, nature, and how the experience of people as tourists going through this journey of 1 hour, 2 hours of tour sort of construct meanings for people, and whose voices are included, whose voices are not included. That was the interesting part for me. So, Allyson, if we could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So I try to sort of remap the road that we had to take the group through, and I try to pay more attention to the icons, ecological icons and touristic human icons that were not visible and were not focused in the Stanley Park. So as a traveling teacher and as an Indigenous woman being displaced, I sort of started to look at the place of Stanley Park as a site of colonial debris, and that kind of connected my own narrative, my own experience with other narratives. One other narrative that was kind of connected to my experiencing of this place was the story of the little student that I call Ron in this story in the community school that I was teaching it through the Community Learning Initiative 2 years before this experience. So in 2010, and I read you the very short dialogue and conversation that sort of emerged, and I connected that to my experience of being at Stanley Park and making meaning of this place in my own way of constructing meaning. So it was in February of 2010 in East Vancouver Community School. I entered the class and I was sort of trying to teach the mythological figure in the ancient Greece, and I showed the student the vase. One student stood up and said, "Is that a Spartan holding the vase?" And I said, "Thank you, Ron. It's not a Spartan. It's actually a slave guardian." And that was the definition that I found on the image. So Ron said, "Cool," and I continued on. And I said, these were the common figures painted on pottery those days. And there was some slavery those days in the history. Unfortunately, we don't have any slavery anymore these days. Suddenly, Ryan, the quiet Indigenous student in the class, stood up and was kind of struggling to talk or give a talk or sort of express his idea. And he said, I pronounced loudly, "Don't think so," softly. We have slavery. And that's something that he said. So silence sort of filled the space of the classroom. And I didn't know what to say. Every morning of February 2010, that's what I wrote on my autobiography. I was riding on the bus number 50 down Hastings Street, and I couldn't stop thinking about what Ryan had to share, and what I could say and did not say, and did not know what to say, and the conversation was kind of sidetracked, and the moment kind of died away when the recess bell rang, and the noise of happiness sort of, yes, replaced that silence, saved me from that moment, but Ryan, and I thought about his narrative and his story that was lost. So in my journey of being 3 months with Jolene in Stanley Park, I sort of had these narratives in my mind that sort of connected with that place. And so I looked at the ecological icons related to the history of the human engineering of the nature. And I tried to remap things, trying to kind of depict a design or a pathway for the tour, the image that could include some of these invisible narratives, some of these invisible kind of icons. For example, when I was walking on the edges of the coast to the east, down there, I sort of paid attention to the broken shells. So the whiteness was related to the broken shells. And when I tracked the story of the broken shells, I found the story of the sawmill industry and sawmill traditions and the people whose stories were connected to sawmill in that region, or the presence of the dead man's island. And I sort of, the presence of that ecological factor emerged to the story and the history of Dead Man's Island and the Navy Resort and all of that. For me, that was very thought-provoking, to connect the history with the ecology, to look at the visible and invisible. And the strange existence of Lost Lagoon Lake, for example, if we could go to the very, thanks, Allyson, thanks. So I kind of juxtaposed the ecological icons with the historical narratives that we found with Jolene as a group to include in the park tour, and the village of Hoi Hoi, where the golf course is. So the story of people of Ryan was related to the village of Hoi Hoi in Stanley Park, and it was just empty, or the golf course. And that's how I sort of try to remap the place according to the stories that sort of evolved. And if we could go to the next slide, thank you. So the narratives, the totems, the narratives, and sort of my connection to the place as an Indigenous woman, as I said, who's displaced, depicted a new picture of Stanley Park for me. As Stoller talks about it, the imperial debris, which is connected with ecological degradation. And I looked at the beautified version of nature and how introduction of new species kind of gave power to some ecosystems that changed the context of the park, but at the same time made a lot of other creators powerless. So power dimension was something that sort of emerged from looking at ecology and history narratives together. And at the very end, the remapping of knowledge, so it was a sort of methodology or approach that unfolded for me to remap the knowledge connected to the local, to the context, towards a new constructive meaning, the co-construction of meaning that happened between me as a woman, as the Indigenous displaced woman, with the land, with the visible stories and not visible stories. So the critical engagement was a part of it. Study instead of doing social change, participatory action, all of that. Study, pausing, pondering, learning, and tracking narratives instead of serving and being really on a very action-go type of phase. And decolonizing and reconceptualizing place related to the story of people and the story of the ecological icons. And that's what I saw. So the Lost Lagoon, as you see at the very narrow type of bridge on the left-hand side, Lost Lagoon is the place that is being segregated from Coal Harbor Ocean. And it is the human-engineered bridging of the land. How has that affected the ecological existence of a lot of creatures, as well as a lot of displacement of people that happened in that area? So I was interested in that as well. So the emergent methodologies for my approach that sort of came with me all the way throughout my journey since 2011 were focused on local citizenship rather than becoming lost in propaganda's claim of politically committed, vested in global citizenship. That's how I saw global citizenship compared to Stanley Park Project. So I was lost in the global citizenship meaning, but then I found a place of refuge in the local citizenship meaning. Number two, engagement with the rural and the marginalized in context. It was sort of an opportunity for me to get connected with those stories. The practitioner approach in collaboration with academic study. So academic not just for the intellectual, philosophical part of it, but the very practitioner contact with the local and community. Moving away from prescription research, like I go into the context, I define a problem, and I invent a remedy for that context. I try to move away from that. Moving away from social change, missionarism. So when I sort of parachute landed at Stanley Park, I thought I'm going to do a lot of things in here. But then I learned that there are a lot of things there that I just have to listen to. And it was an inductive approach. It was a bottom-up kind of research for me. It was constructive. The meaning was constructive. It was not the reality that was sort of there for me to see. We changed signs. We changed roads. So the meaning changed. The people who came with me and Jolene on the day of the tour, they sort of saw a different space compared to the road that would take them to specific stops. Multiple realities emerged and multiple paradigms and worldviews. So for me, it was worldview for me that sort of emerged. Thank you, Allyson. And I connected my story to Ellen Neal's story and her artwork. So I did some artwork related to the Stanley Park. At the very beginning of the term in January, I didn't know how to dress the picture, which sort of represented my being as being lost in all these global, local notions of citizenship. But when I passed through Stanley Park and all that meaning-making process, I sort of dressed the image in the traditional clothes of the places that I came from. Not the First Nations here, because I sort of connected to the local that I was sort of coming from. So it was a back track for me. And that was it. That was in a nutshell. Thank you.
So as Ms. Mahtab described, certainly the course was a learning experience for students and also for me. I learned a few things that I think I needed to know about, the idea of integrating service learning into courses and, its potentialities and also its challenges as Allyson sort of spelled out. So in the context of sort of this bit of overview that we've given of decolonizing place-based learning and Mahtab's particular experience as well, one of the things I think we can sort of pull from that, and it's not the only thing, but certainly it's one of the things that I think is important to focus on, particularly given where we are on these unceded ancestral Musqueam lands, is that, across Canada and really across the Americas, colonialism has meant the invasion and subsequent large-scale theft of Indigenous lands and domination over the meager lands that that were retained. So it's meant the systematic sort of interference of Indigenous ways of being and the assaults on all aspects of Indigenous life, including physical bodies, means of sustenance, spirituality, languages, gender relations, and kinship, economic and educational systems. So as a result of this, many Canadians have not had the opportunity to learn where they are in terms of an Indigenous landscape. And so we have a bit of an exercise here that we'd like to engage you with related to all of that. And the way we framed it and titled it, it's a little bit of a humor thing for me because that, when you're an Indigenous person and you're traveling around in community contexts, one of the things people will say to you is, you might introduce yourself and they'll say, well, who's your granny? Kind of thing, because that's how the genealogical sort of kinship connections is how you're known. And so we've titled this exercise, who's your granny? And we've got some maps here that we'd like you to sort of take a look at in pairs of twos if you can. So one of each of those maps. Yeah. So one of those is, they're all sort of Indigenous focus maps, and one of them is of the BC context. One is North America and one is the world. And so thanks, Allyson, for printing those in color like that. They look pretty good. And so what we'd like you to do is just sort of, with those maps as a prop, is to sort of look at these various questions that we've put together, meant to prompt you to sort of think about some of these issues related to decolonizing place-based learning. So basically these are the questions. Whose traditional territory did your granny, so we all have grandmothers, whether they're still with us or not, or even another significant mentor, where did they live, whose traditional territory? Did they talk to you about this? If not, can you think of the reasons why that might have been? Do you know whose traditional territory you grew up on? And if so, how did you come to learn this? What did it mean to you when you first learned it? What does it mean to you now? Are there reasons for focusing learning on these territories now? And then finally, what places of significance do you recall from your youth? What connection might these have to the territories that you've thought about in number 1 or 2? And what is our responsibility for teaching about places in general?
My grandmother was French Canadian, but she's from the valley. But we knew quite a bit when we grew up about Potawatomi, which was in the Wisconsin area, right? And the river that ran through the city was named after them. There's stories, a lot of people met. And I'm actually I would even call them if they were just stories. That no meaning, they were just fictitious.
I can remember being a kid in pictures of being in paper bags. That was my idea of a First Nations person, when I was very young. But it's changed greatly since.
I grew up collecting little arrowheads when I was a kid on the farms because they were still pretty prevalent in the farming areas. And then my father had also done that. So we used to tell stories about the place and about the people who were in the land prior to his land, which I found to be significant. It made you feel as if you were part of something. Because otherwise, most of the people in the area where I grew up were all assimilated pretty heavily into what it meant to be American, right? So have you ever been to that area?
No, I haven't.
They have really incredible efficacy ones that are all these wonderful shapes. So a lot of them have been preserved.
Susan Roy writes an interesting paper here. Actually, she has a book now. It's called These Mysterious People, and it's focused on Seshnam, which was where they were protesting last year with the condo development in Musqueam. And she had some really interesting case for situating sort of history in a Musqueam cultural and political context, because it's tended to be situated in a disciplinary context like archaeology or anthropology, and so there are remains of that are found at Sheshnam, which are up to 4,000 years old, and in some cases have been sort of separated from the current Musqueam people. So, theories, in the mid-20th century were that this was a people that preceded Musqueam, and Musqueam probably came and sort of, overrode these people and so forth. And many of those theories, is how Susan Roy talks about them, they're meant to sort of separate sort of Musqueam people, from the history of this place kind of thing. And so much of the pot collecting and so forth that went on in the 30s and 40s and stuff like that, were objects taken, because that's what people did at that time, but they were also constructed as being sort of different than the Musqueam people who lived there at that moment in time, and so she does a really good job of presenting an analysis of how that happens in history and so forth. I thought of it when you were talking about the arrowheads, and so forth. We think of it as almost a prehistoric remnant of people who were here before, but often, as Susan does, and kind of scratches below the surface, it's like these are, objects belonging to the people here now, kind of thing. It's kind of interesting. It's a great read. It's 2010 book, These Mysterious People, through UBC Press.
I'll have to take a look.
Yeah, really good.
There was a time when I used to use the narratives from this area in Wisconsin with students to talk about ethnicity, because people have gone around and have created short videos of them doing various things that are still done related to fishing or to trapping and the use of animal fur and the kind of integrity associated with how they still go about it in understanding how their way of life is actually based on the fact that they were taking something but then they were giving back. And it was, it brought up a lot of issues because of the kinds of protests against the fur industry and stuff, which is very different than what it is that they were what they were doing. And so I just, the narrative associated with the place for me has always been the kind of the powerful part of what it is, we're trying to learn about.
Something the global map made me think of was, I can't remember the title of this book, but it's followed on the heels of the human genome. And being able to map the movement of humans over time. And your granny's granny kind of, going back and seeing that made me feel part of a variety of different families, if you know what I mean, like that indigeneity included me somewhere along the line. Does that make sense? Like Indigenous peoples are everywhere, including who I am. It's things like that that have been significant for me to make me feel like a part of a bigger family rather than something special or different. So there's that push and pull in this conversation where you're pushed to be part of an Indigenous group, but you also are all part of that series of Indigenous groups. You can trace your...
Yeah, and similar to that, like a mapping of settler colonialism, because, as I said, like these maps tended to sort of center Europe, in very strategic sorts of ways, and how colonialism sort of spread from the center to peripheries is also something that, in terms of positionality, is something that, is worth thinking about. So, and who stood to benefit from that spread of colonialism, even continuing today, and who suffers the most consequences. I mean, at some levels, everybody suffered, everything suffered, right, from kind of an oppressive, ideology like that. But just in particular, in terms of particular lands and places and so forth, just created an incredible amount of displacement. Still today, it's still happening today, right? And so it is interesting to kind of keep taking steps back to kind of get different views of these sorts of things as well.
My nephew, he's 9 years old. He just went to a museum of some sort, and he was a science museum. And he came back from the science museum, and he was like, "Oh, Auntie Allyson, did you know that you're related to frogs? Like, we all are related in some way, shape, or form." And he was so fascinated that we were all related. And I was like, "Oh yeah, we're all related." But it's your identity in today's social context can have multiple different meanings, and how important it is to, yes, take that step back, but also kind of go up really close as well, and be able to go back and forth, because some people are much closer to that identity than other people, and to be able to recognize, what you can claim, because the repercussions are so close. Yeah, but it is so funny that, my nephew, like, coming to that realization, it's like, wow, we're all related. Like, it's not just me and my body, but we're all related in some way, in some form. But then coming to that balance of where is it?
Yeah, for me, that the metaphor of Stanley Park worked that way. Like, if I look at the design, I see that some meanings are brought forth, but this bringing forth in design is well structured within a power kind of relationship. So the genetic kind of tracking of the ethnicities is very much invested within the genome projects, and it's all about the science and who gets to make meaning of that knowledge, because knowledge is constructive, like you can form it any way. It really depends how you bring forth that meaning and kind of disempower and marginalize other ways of kind of. So those genome things, I think, were very problematic. The articles that I read were kind of focusing one center for making meaning of things, and kind of excluded a lot of other,
I think that's what's led to a lot of problems in today's world, is that certain people have specifically focused on what they wanted to happen, and the rest of us just kind of go along with it and say, oh yeah, that's how the world is changing. Your example, Tracy, that you gave about the Indigenous women, Medicine women. What an education, as well as the Stanley Park example, in terms of how to convey a different meaning to people and let us make our own assumptions and our own meanings and our own perception shifts. And I've lived in Vancouver for 35 years, and I love Stanley Park. I've spent many, many hours in Stanley Park, but I've always pondered exactly what you said. What's the history of this place? And you can go and you can see the signs, the tourist signs, and it's all geared towards money, especially money making now. It's changing more and more. And I've always wondered, what's the true history behind Stanley Park? What did it look like 100 years ago, 200 years ago? And so this has been a beautiful day for me because it's really tapped into a lot of the questions that I've had about place and about my own identity and where we all fit into this big picture. So thank you so much for your presentation. It's very meaningful.
So has place become so institutionalized that it's been, the term's been colonized?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I find in my own travels, like in Indigenous research and teaching and learning and so forth, that land is becoming, you know, much more, you know, used. It's much more in vogue to use the term land, to be honest with you, land-based and so forth. Part of that, I think, is, you know, is a political assertion, right? That it's tied into sort of the resurgence that we kind of see going on right now with Indigenous groups in Canada, for sure. But, yeah, I mean, you know, there's still a lot of philosophizing about place, including from Indigenous folks, that seems to have a lot of merit in terms of thinking about, you know, our connections to the local and so forth.
Is place a term used in a lot of Indigenous languages? Or is it
not as much as land?
Land.
Not as much as land. Yeah. And when the Indigenous people, as you know, talk about land, typically they're talking about the local anyway. So they're not. It's not some generic idea of land over there, or typically talking about traditional territories and so forth.
I think an example of that is the controversy over the Enbridge pipeline. And I went to a seminar just last week. It was Dr. Brayboy that came up from the States. Right. And when I went in, they handed out a little card. And it was not really a contest, but it was an opportunity for people to submit their Indigenous art. And it was sponsored by Enbridge, the Government of Canada, the Royal Bank, you know, all the big players. And I thought, wow. So now, I think it's called greenwashing, where they go in and they you know, say, oh, we're behind you. We want to promote your community and your land. And they may have another agenda behind all of that. And to me, that's
interesting. It makes me think the World Bank must have some vested interest in Enbridge.
Well, maybe the World Bank wasn't on that. They were big players, so I'm sure they were big. That's the case.
Actually, did an analysis, a semiotic analysis of a Shell ad in 2008. It was published in Visual Studies. It was the same kind of thing. It was a greenwashing kind of effort in terms of, you know, their corporate social responsibility efforts. And so I did an analysis of the ads they were using and so forth. It was quite interesting.
Toyota used to have like natural or plants growing out of its logo. Like the cars they make are so natural. They actually have plants growing out of their logo. I mean, the way that gets used is just amazing nowadays because of the ability to animate and do simulations. So.
Yeah, in this case it was an image, a historical image of like a chief, some kind of a Plains Indian chief, and the image sort of transformed, like it was like in halves, but the right-hand side transformed to a younger, sort of more contemporary looking Indigenous person, but the colors also changed, very white, really faded, you know, lighter in color, and it was used in conjunction with some other advertisements and so forth, all of which kind of, add up to this idea of sort of erasing Indigenous presence, as sort of stewards of the land, and sort of bringing them into this this mega narrative of development and so on.
Rather than the adversarial scenario that's created that we see today.
And the irony of that, I did a bit of research in Northern Alberta, is that promises that are often made as part of these regulatory activities when Cambridge will, be, presenting a case to the regulatory commission and so forth, which I think in this case is a joint mutual, and they'll be sort of describing, the employment opportunities that will be available and so forth. But in Northern Alberta, the large-scale projects that have been approved over the years, it has never manifested into jobs for Native people. Like that's just not, the way these things play out. So it's quite interesting. And there's a variety of reasons for that as well. But and your thoughts on that?
I just thought it was interesting. We're from the elementary education program. I just thought it was really interesting with Stanley Park project and just how we do rethink about where we're taking kids on field trips and the narratives we're telling them just through place. So thank you for that, and it really kind of opened my eyes. But I don't know anything to that.
I also think it's coming from an educational perspective. I remember when I went to school, we had very, very little teachings about Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal land, the land that the school was on or where we come from. And honestly, it's not till this program, being in the social justice and diversity program or cohort, that I have just been enlightened with an amazing wealth of information, and I'm so grateful for that. So.
I also feel kind of cheated though.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
well, I think it's really great that now there is that kind of that focus and the importance and is really being given to these huge issues and topics. And I think that teachers that are coming out of this program are going to take that into their classroom and hopefully
change it.
The youth of tomorrow will be educated.
And I think that would also change the focus on getting a grade or getting a lot rather than really understanding and learning.
Exactly.
Because
that's the
true
value.
education. Yeah.
For us, in the student perspective, in Tracy's class, so the group kind of, the relationships within the group were pretty much affected by these kind of critical engagements and how we stopped thinking about our own agendas and our own kind of goals and our own kind of plans. So it was a very human kind of relationship that sort of unfolded and emerged within that group. So we're in touch with each other, and all of us kind of dispersed throughout the world to different places that we came from. But again, we're in touch and we talk about that experience, and it's been very the connecting to community has been very, very way-finding for all of us. So that was the very start, I think, for all of us during. So in the student perspective, I guess that was something that we experienced. And
have the two of you done your student teaching now?
Yeah, we're in the 2-year program actually.
And so were you actually able to implement some of the social justice type of curriculum that you wanted to when you went to do your student teaching?
We were encouraged.
Yeah, we had some funding, not a lot, to do social justice projects. So
how did it fit with the current IRPs that are on the books? I mean, were you able to make connections fairly easily?
yeah,
Absolutely.
And people did a really wide range of stuff,
There's a huge social responsibility aspect in curriculums.
Yeah. You know, a lot of people did like ecological projects. Some people focus more on.
We're also with the NITEP program. So I think one of our colleagues, he actually caught the funding, and I'm not sure if he did something great with it. So.
That's good. That's encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know with the new program, there's the enhanced practicum, which you're talking about, where the students are actually encouraged to make community connections and think about how they can bring that back to the classroom. And, so it's becoming more prevalent, I think.
Do we have time for one? One thing that troubles me about that is if you go out and do service learning, the organization that you go to has their own agenda, right? Yeah. And then here we are coming in with a social justice focus. But how do we know that the two coincide? Because if they don't, then that keeps the hegemony in place. And that's, to me, that's what needs to shift. You know?
There's interesting research that was just coming out last year. I went to a service learning conference, and they were talking about the plurality of ways that service learning can be set up. It can be set up in terms of charity, and it can be set up in terms of social justice. A social justice model on each of the partners, so on the faculty partner, on the student partner, and on the community partner. And all three of them have value. Both charity and social justice service learning have value in some way, shape, or form, but it's about aligning the intentions of the student community and faculty member. And when you align those intentions, the learning that comes from the students is so much greater. It's when it's the misalignment, when you have a social justice-oriented placement and a charity-oriented student, where things really kind of fall off. And it's about that research was talking about the design and the intentionality of the matching between students and what they wanted to get out of it. Because I think you're absolutely right that if it's charity with the social justice lens,
it's those types of programs that keep the marginalization in place. And so it's often not
charity-based programs.
Yeah, it depends on how you look at it, maybe.
I think a lot of things keep marginalization in place, and some of the organizations, their ask for students is just, we just need hands on deck right now, and that's okay. That is also valuable to have hands on deck.
It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to change overnight.
Exactly.
So
it's about.
I think the level too. So, for instance, with graduate students, I think the misalignment, which is in some ways can be disrupting, which in some ways can serve the course objectives depending on how you set it up. But I think you can do more of that, sort of like I say, with graduate students than with undergrads. And conversely, you can probably do more with grad students than you can with, say, secondary students and so forth. So for me, like, the misalignment works well in some ways because it that disrupting, I think, is really important in some cases.
Well, the students would be developmentally ready to grapple with that. But if you think about 18-year-olds, like first-year university, they're grappling with so much that they would be able to make sense of that misalignment. They're just trying to get out of bed and get to class on time. And having that type of student in a social justice-oriented placement would be really difficult. Like if it was high level.
So in this context, what Tracy introduced to us was the readings by Westheimer about the notion of citizenship and how many sorts of different notions of citizenship might emerge from this collaboration. So our take on it was very critical, being critical to our being positioned within that connection of university and the community. And that was very much guiding us, guiding me. I can speak of my own. So we were talking about citizenship for social reproduction, which is reproducing marginalization in many ways, and also critical social engagement and all of that. So I think in this context, it sort of went well because we had the background knowledge how to draw on all of these notions.
Sounds like a great class.
Does community-based learning have a relationship with sustainability initiative going on?
We have a relationship in some way, shape, or form. I'm not sure what it is, though. Somebody, 2 people from my office are sitting in on that. The work that's happening there.
Okay.
But I'm not sure.
And the Green City Studio?
Yeah, we have a relationship with them as well. It's also new. I'm not sure. I wouldn't be able to speak to any of the developments there, but I know that my director is talking, is in partnership and conversations with City Studio.
There's a real big difference between some of the work being done that's very kind of pro-eco-justice or social justice, and then some of it which is really much more just kind of economic-driven service type of learning that has no sense of bringing about some type of positive change, right? And so it kind of goes to the question I'm talking about. And it's really difficult to make those kinds of distinctions sometimes early on when you're trying to form partnerships. So if we can get our students to recognize them early so they can actually be more kind of proactive as they go to create their own, it would be really great.
So, and just to close up a few comments at the end here, just in terms of thinking about this area a bit more, decolonizing distance learning, and what can we do outside of classrooms, for example. And so, just a few points, some of which, if you haven't read Susan Dion's Braiding Histories, that's a good place to look as well. So, engage local communities using the 4 R's. That's a well-known article, respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity. That's worth reading. Protocols are important, so endeavor to learn them in particular contexts. So there's each Indigenous group in the Lower Mainland, for instance, has their own set of community protocols about how to, for instance, if you were thinking about engaging with the local community around some activity in the classroom and having somebody come in, every group has their own sort of protocol, so you need to connect with community members and find out what those are. And basically get educated about where you are. So learning local history is something we can all continue to do. It's a lifelong journey. Attend community events, volunteer if you have the chance, and take the time to build relationships. It's really about familiarity and trust and so forth. It's how these relationships get stronger. And be an ally, instead of a leader. So sometimes the work of social change involves, getting behind projects rather than sort of out in front of them. So just a few, basic tips and so forth. But thanks so much for coming and for your engagement in the session. And we really appreciate that. Thank you.